Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's OnBoard question and answer session for healthcare providers. Please keep your phone lines muted. We will be taking in your questions through the chat box. When sending your questions in the chat box, send them to all panelists. We are joined today by members of the project leadership team and subject matter experts from various board areas who will be answering your questions today. We'll start with the latest OnBoard enhancements made to the Request for Decision on Unpaid Medical Bills, Form HP 1.0. Then we will review the most common questions we have received from providers. I'll turn it over to Pam from the board's Public Information Office to begin.
Thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Mike mentioned recently, OnBoard introduced enhancements to the Request for Decision on Unpaid Medical Bills process, otherwise known as Form HP 1.0. These enhancements follow healthcare provider and medical suppliers to submit Form HP 1.0 when, number one, the claim was previously controverted via a first report of injury, SROI 04, or subsequent report of injury, SROI 04 denial. Two, the notice of treatment issue or disputed bill, Form C 8.1, was never received. And or three, the claim is now established. In addition, there have been several field label changes throughout the form. For example, the section where information about a legal objection is entered has been relabeled from Form C 8.1 to Form C 8.1b or denial. The question, have you received Form C 8.1b from the claim administrator, has been changed to have you received either Form C 8.1b or a SROI 04 denial from the claim administrator. Lastly, beginning in July 2022, the Form C 8.1 will be renamed to Form C 8.1b. The instruction web pages for the HP 1.0 submission process have been updated with the latest instructions and screenshots. To view these enhancements, go to wcb.ny.gov/onboard and select Training for Healthcare Providers or Medical Suppliers. Next, let's review the latest frequently asked questions we've received specific to any phase of our OnBoard rollout. Following this FAQ walkthrough, we'll spend the rest of the time addressing any questions you have today. So let's dive in with the first FAQ here. Question 1, where should frequency and or duration be entered for applicable treatment? As part of every submission within OnBoard, the healthcare provider is required to enter or upload a statement of medical necessity and or medical supporting documentation. If your request includes therapeutic modalities, including physical therapy, occupational therapy, chiropractic, and or acupuncture services, include the specific frequency and duration of the requested treatment in the medical necessity field, highlighted below. If your request includes spinal levels, include the specific spinal levels applicable to the request in the medical necessity field, highlighted. Next question here, how do we find the CPT codes? The provider just needs to know the modality. As with previous attending doctor's request for approval of variance in carrier's response, Form MG2, the provider would need to submit the request for individual modalities. By entering the modality, the drop-down will provide a list of choices that includes that word. You will need to choose the code that best describes the treatment modality you entered. If the reference code noted in the question is for the MTG reference code, then you would need to enter the specific modality, example, manipulation, that you are seeking. Question 3, can multiple CPT codes be added to the same submission? Yes. To add multiple CPT codes, you will add additional request items to your submission. Each request item will require a CPT code to be entered. If the PAR types are the same, they will navigate the system together under a single PAR ID. If they are different PAR types, they will each be assigned their own unique PAR ID to navigate through the system. Question 4, can you edit Form HP 1.0 if it was filed incorrectly? No, you cannot edit Form HP 1.0 that has already been submitted. A new one will need to be submitted. Question 5, do I have to request an order of the chair, or does one automatically generate? Orders of the chair are automatically generated for non-medication PARs in OnBoard. Question 6, how do I register? You'd select the medical portal from the board's homepage at wcb.ny.gov. Then select Access and Administration, followed by Sign up for access to the medical portal. Do not use the Create Account link on the ny.gov ID sign-in page. Question 7, can one organization with multiple providers use one account to process all requests? Every healthcare provider and assigned delegate will need their own board-assigned username and password. A single username and password cannot be provided to a provider group under a single tax ID number to be used by all providers and delegates who are part of that group. Question 8, will third-party billing companies be able to obtain their own usernames and passwords for PARs or requests for decisions on unpaid medical bills, Form HP 1.0? Providers will be required to designate their provider delegates and billing delegates within the system, which may include third-party billing companies. Users assigned to the billing delegate role may draft and submit HP 1.0s. Users assigned to the provider delegate role may draft and submit HP 1.0s and also draft PARs. Next question here, how do providers link to their submission to a claim? Providers are required to complete a claim search prior to submitting a PAR. To match to a claim, you will first need the WCB case number or claim admin claim number. Next, you are required to enter 2 of the next 4 fields, which are date of injury, last 4 of Social Security number, date of birth, or patient last name. If you do not match to a claim after 2 attempts, you may proceed without matching to a claim, and the board will attempt to locate the claim for your submission. To proceed, you will need the patient first name, patient last name, patient address, patient city, patient date of birth, patient date of injury, employer name, employer address, employer city, and employer zip code. If a matching claim is not found within 5 days, your request will be closed and you will be notified. The patient should then be instructed to submit a claim and notify their employer of their injury. Question 10, should providers submit post-operative PARs along with a surgery PAR? For example, a special services PAR for a surgery, a DME PAR for post-operative DME, and an MTG confirmation PAR for post-operative physical therapy. For the efficient delivery of care, we recommend that once a PAR for surgery has been approved and the surgery has been scheduled, but before the surgery is performed, the provider should submit an additional PAR for any necessary post-operative physical therapy, whether provided in the home or provided on an ambulatory basis, as well as for any necessary post-operative durable medical equipment, or DME. The hope is that doing so will reduce the likelihood of any PAR-related delays in obtaining necessary goods and services during the post-operative period. Thank you again for your participation today. For the remainder of our time, we'll answer all the questions that you have have submitted via the chat function. So I'll now turn it back over to Mike and to kick off Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. We're going to take a brief moment now to review the questions submitted, and we will be back shortly. Thank you.
There's a question, is it necessary to, this is Dr. Tachi, is it necessary to submit a PAR for treatment or diagnostic test that is listed in the medical treatment guidelines? So for a treatment that is listed in the medical treatment guidelines that is recommended in the medical treatment guideline, you are not required to submit a PAR unless you submit an optional confirmation PAR to get a determination before you proceed. And if you do submit an optional confirmation PAR, which is analogous to the old MG1 forms, then the carrier, the insurer, is required to respond. The only exception to this is for services that are in the medical treatment guidelines as recommended that are also listed as the special services that require PARs. So as folks know by regulation, there's about a dozen or so special services that require prior authorization. So even though those may be listed as recommended in the MTGs, those also require a PAR.
There's a couple of questions submitted asking about receiving copies of the slides we just went through. And following the webinar, we will be sending an email this week, which will contain a recording of today's presentation and the slides used. In addition to the follow-up email, we will be posting the slides and the recording on the healthcare provider training webpage and on the resources OnBoard page.
There was a second part to that PAR in the MTG's question. So yes, PARs are still required for anything that is either not consistent with the recommendations in the MTGs or not in the MTGs, or for which there is not an MTG. Also, there was a comment that several new MTGs became effective on the same date, and we did try to have not only the MTGs themselves available for a long time, both through the public comment period, but then in the rollout to the go live period, but also we had the trainings online for folks as well on each of the new MTGs.
Hi, this is Melissa. There's a question stating that there's confusion about what information should be in the variance after the PAR has been denied, and the provider should be responding to what the insurance carrier's denial stated. So it should be documentation to further support the variance request.
There's a question about additional documentation, and can the provider add documentation when requesting review at level 2 or level 3? And the answer is that the provider cannot. Once the PAR is submitted, the supporting documentation remains the same. The only time when the provider can add additional documentation is if the payer requests it during through the request for information feature in OBLR. If a PAR is denied because documentation is not sufficient or not present, and the provider has more documentation, they should submit a new PAR with that additional or improved documentation.
There's a question about if there is help or information related to how to fill out the different types of PARs. The board actually has a great resource on the website. If you visit the board website, at the top you'll see the Learn About OnBoard button. If you click that, within each stakeholder type, providers, medical suppliers, payers, and attorneys, there's a training section. If you click training, there's actual buttons there to navigate your dashboard, how to submit a PAR. It's a great resource with step-by-step instructions as well as screenshots. There's also a question, how many calendar days do a provider have to appeal a level 2 denial? It is 10 calendar days. After that 10th calendar day, that PAR will then become final, and you will not have the ability to escalate it to level 3.
Hi, this is Audrey Cunningham from the Medical Director's Office. There's a question with respect to knowing the exact CPT codes when submitting a prior authorization. So the process in terms of submitting an MTG variance authorization has not changed in terms of knowing what the modality of which you're requesting. Once you put the modality in, the CPT codes, there should be drop downs for the specific CPT codes related to the modality that you're requesting. To the extent that you may not know the exact CPT code, it is in the system.
Hi, there's a question, can you submit 2 meds at a time for a PAR? The answer is no, each medication is its own separate prior authorization request.
Just to clarify on that point, when you're submitting a medication PAR, as part of the same submission, you can enter 2 medications, but when it's submitted into the system, they will separate and they will each have their own unique PAR ID.
There's a question, why do we need to submit a PAR for postoperative PT that is part of the guidelines? Just to be clear, in the presentation, things like physical therapy, et cetera, were just provided as examples, and we're not meant to indicate specific PAR type requirements or not. If postoperative physical therapy is specifically listed as recommended in the medical treatment guidelines, then you could submit a confirmation PAR if you want to, but you don't have to, or you could submit a confirmation PAR if you wanted to specify the duration and number of PT treatments you're requesting.
There's a question about paper claim forms and whether the board is eliminating them entirely. To be clear, the board is has eliminated paper forms that were used to request prior authorization. The MG1 form, the MG2 form, the C4 auth form. But that's only applicable to prior authorization where you have to use OnBoard limited release. We strongly encourage providers to submit bills electronically using XML. And we're in the process of adopting the CMS 1500 as our standard for paper or electronic billing, but the paper bills have not been eliminated. Providers can continue to submit bills in paper.
There's a question as to whether physical therapists are allowed to request prior authorization. Physical therapists cannot request prior authorization for MTG-related body parts, only non-MTG over and under $1,000. That's why it's saying that you're not allowed. So no MTG-related body parts.
There's a question about PARs that are submitted where the claim administrator approves agreeing that the treatment is medically necessary and what that means for payment of the bill. The question specifically references MTG confirmation PARs, but it's really applicable to all. If the payer is granting treatment for a site that has not been established or a claim that has not been established or accepted, they should be granting without prejudice so that you're aware that that's what they're doing. But the agreement that the treatment is medically necessary is not necessarily an agreement to pay the bill, because the bill would only, The carrier would be unable to object to the bill later on the basis that it wasn't medically necessary, but there would need to be an accepted or established claim in sight for the bill to truly be compensable. There's a question about HP1s and do I need to submit a new HP1 if one was submitted on paper prior to OnBoard limited release? No, please do not resubmit HP1s that are still pending that were submitted in paper. It's only new HP1s going forward that need to be submitted through OnBoard limited release. And then a second question is, once providers have access to the medical portal and OnBoard limited release, can we upload medical records that you would normally fax to the board? OnBoard limited release is solely for HP1s and prior authorization requests. If you're sending medical reports or you're sending medical bills with attached reports, those submissions would happen outside of OnBoard limited release. As we said before, we encourage those bills to be submitted electronically with an XML trading partner, but we will continue to accept them in paper or by email or however you're currently submitting them.
There's a question as to whether draft PARs can be edited prior to submission, and the answer is yes. As long as they haven't been submitted, you can go back in and edit them, but once submitted, you cannot.
There's a question about what happens if a patient seeks treatment from a different organization and they submit a PAR. There is currently a duplicate check that prevents the same provider from submitting a PAR on the same claim for the same treatment. But that duplicate check does not extend to PARs that may have been submitted by other providers. Similarly, there's a question about multiple treatments for different body parts for the same claim. The system would allow two different PARs to be submitted, provided they are requesting different things, whether it's a different treatment or treatment for a different body part.
Dovetailing off of that answer, there was another question earlier about resubmission of the same PAR for the same body part for which the treatment or intervention has been denied. And the answer is that providers really should not be resubmitting the same PAR for the same treatment and same body part unless there's been a clinically significant change in the patient's status that warrants reconsideration of the request.
There's a question with respect to the difference between a confirmation and a variance PAR. An MTG variance PAR is when a treating provider submits prior authorization for treatment that varies from the medical treatment guidelines, whereas a confirmation PAR is optional on the part of a treating provider, and that is a prior authorization for treatment within the MTG guidelines that does not vary from the guidelines.
Also, building off the prior discussion about potentially duplicate requests, there is no way for a provider to see PARs submitted by other providers. You can only see those that you, as a user, have submitted.
There's a question, when the PAR does not include frequency or duration for physical therapy, what frequency or duration should the provider follow? Our very strong recommendation, as was noted in the presentation, is that the provider submitting the PAR originally should specify the frequency and duration of the physical therapy in the text field. If not, the insurer may respond with the recommended duration and frequency. And as with all of the MTGs and all of the physical therapy being offered, it should be consistent with the recommendations in the medical treatment guidelines.
We've received additional questions with respect to the CPT codes and physical therapy. Again, if you're requesting if the request is for physical therapy. The modality related to the treatment must be in the prior authorization, as well as the CPT codes. The system is asking for CPT codes. Again, you don't need to memorize the codes. Once you put in the modality and begin to type in the various treatments, the codes should self-generate.
There's a question, should we submit another PAR request if the first one with additional information was denied? Can we appeal the denial? So as was stated before, you can request a level 3 review of any PARs that are denied. If it's denied at level 3, then a PAR really should not be resubmitted unless there's been a clinical change in the person's status, in which case you can resubmit the same PAR for the same body part, treatment, etc. If you disagree with the level 3 determination and there has been no change in clinical status, then it is up to your patient and or their representative as to whether or not they would like the question to be adjudicated.
There's a follow-up question regarding paper billing. Just to restate, there is no requirement that medical bills be submitted electronically. We strongly encourage that they be submitted electronically by an XML trading partner, but no, the board nor any insurance carrier no one should be rejecting paper bills. And there's no date by which we plan to stop accepting paper bills. There's a question about the C-27. That remains a board paper form that would be submitted by mail to our PO box or email or secure upload or whatever else. The C-27 is not part of OnBoard limited release.
There's a question, what to do when the patient's doctor is not registered with OnBoard to submit PARs for physical therapy. So in order to be that patient's treating provider in New York State, that provider has to be licensed and authorized by the Workers' Comp Board, and in turn has to register with OnBoard. With respect to out-of-state providers, they have to register with OnBoard in order to submit PARs. So if the onus is on the provider who is requesting or prescribing physical therapy to be registered with OnBoard.
There's a question about whether delegate staff for a provider fall under the payers and OnBoard process. They would not. So that provider can add either a provider delegate, which has the ability to draft PARs and submit HP1s, or a billing delegate who has the ability to draft and submit HP1s. That provider will visit our website. In the online services dropdown, there's an option called Medical Portal Administration. Under that, when they log in, they would have the ability to select provider delegate or billing delegate and add whichever users they need to from the office. If they're having difficulty with that, under Access and Administration, on the Medical Portal Overview page, under Resources, there's a great registration guide with screenshots that actually will walk the user through the step-by-step for that.
There's a question that states treating providers are using confirmation, old language MG1 PAR instead of variance PARs, which is not allowing time for an IME when needed. How can this be avoided? And the answer is that presumably the requesting providers are familiar enough with the medical treatment guidelines to know when their treatment is consistent with the guidelines, and in that case be submitting a confirmation PAR, versus when their treatment might vary from the medical treatment guidelines, thereby requiring the variance PAR. If a provider incorrectly submits what should be a variance PAR as a confirmation PAR, that PAR can be declined or denied by the insurer as having been submitted as the wrong PAR type and requiring a variance PAR.
So there are a lot of questions about CPT codes being included on PARs and whether or not they're required. It seems a lot of that is related to physical therapists and occupational therapists who don't have the ability in most instances to enter the PAR themselves. When entering any treatment request, you need to include whoever is making the request needs to include the CPT request with each item within the PAR. It would be our recommendation that every body part being treated, every modality that may be treated, be included. Otherwise, there may end up being a billing dispute between there's nothing to say that you can't bill for CPT codes that were not included, but the payer could also then dispute the bill on the basis that the prior authorization they gave did not include those CPT codes. But please keep in mind that if you're treating within the medical treatment guidelines, or you're treating a body part that does not have a medical treatment guideline and the estimated cost is under $1,000, prior authorization is not required. It's optional on behalf of the provider. There's a question about MTG variances where there's multiple treatments being requested. As long as those, well, any PAR is only for a single claim. But if you're requesting multiple items that all require a variance on the same claim and you're putting them in at the same time, the OBLR system will keep them together as a single PAR. If you enter items that some of them are an MTG variance and some of them are an MTG confirmation, those are going to get split into two separate PARs. But all items that have the same PAR type would stay in the same PAR. The only exception to that rule across the system is medication. Medications get split into individual PARs no matter how many are entered when the request is created.
There's a question, do I have to submit an HP1 if one was already filed prior to OnBoard? And as was mentioned earlier, no, you do not. If an HP1 was filed prior to the phased launch of OnBoard that included HP1s, you'd specifically not want to file a second one, and the first one will be processed after the launch date that was effective for HP1s. Of course, you would not be filing a paper form.
It looks like there's a couple of questions about the C4 family of forms that have been used for medical billing, C4, C4.2, the C5, I can't think of all of them. Those forms are also becoming obsolete this summer as we transition to the CMS 1500 as our billing standard. But again, those forms are not submitted through OnBoard limited release. We encourage providers to sign up with an XML trading partner and submit those bills electronically, but they are still submitted. They can still be submitted through the current mechanisms by mailing paper, by emailing, by whatever else. The only other point I think we want to make here is that as you move to the CMS 1500, it is important that providers pay attention to our requirements for a medical narrative and certain questions that need to be addressed in the medical narrative that if you use the C4 or C4.2 form today would be asked as specific questions. Things like, is the injury and the treatment causally related? What is the claimant's work status? What is the claimant's percentage of impairment? You want to make sure that you answer those questions so that we don't get into billing disputes down the line and we don't end up in situations where the patient's indemnity benefits potentially are impacted because the carrier doesn't have up-to-date information about the claimant's condition.
There's a question from a psychologist regarding treatment after a PAR variance is denied. That if it's If the PAR is denied at a level 2, you as the treating provider can escalate that to a level 3 for the medical director's office to review here at the board.
There's a question from a provider, how a PAR got escalated to level 2 if the provider had not requested the level 2. Any medical denial at level 1 is automatically escalated, with the exception of medication PARs, is automatically escalated to level 2 for a medical review by the payer.
Now, there's a question, does the provider now need to submit a PAR for different items? For example, EMG, MRI, PT, etc. Your guide is the medical treatment guidelines. And for those items that are recommended under the medical treatment guidelines, submission of a PAR is optional unless those are special services. But you still have the optional ability to submit a confirmation PAR if you want to. For those diagnostics or treatments that may vary from the medical treatment guidelines, then you would have to submit a variance PAR.
There is a question about third-party vendors and submission of PARs. There are no third-party vendor uses of OnBoard limited release. Providers can designate delegates, and that can be a billing delegate or a other delegate, and those delegates can prepare PAR submissions, but it's ultimately the provider that actually has to submit the PAR, no matter who drafted it.
There's a question, who does the level 2 reviews if a provider has not requested the level 2 review? As was previously stated, for non-medication PARs, there's an automatic escalation to level 2, and the level 2 reviews are performed by the insurance carrier's physician.
I want to issue a clarification about attaching additional supporting documentation. The provider cannot attach additional supporting documentation when escalating to level 3. However, for medication PARs, which, as we've said a couple times now, are the only PARs that can be escalated to level 2 by the provider can attach additional documentation when making that escalation to level 2. For all other PAR types, because the escalation to level 2 is automatic, there's never an opportunity for the provider to attach additional documentation.
There's a question about attorneys and what access they have. Attorneys do not have direct access to OnBoard limited release. However, attorneys through their e-case administrator can log into their e-case administrator page and add a PAR notification email for certain PAR types, levels. Anytime a status change happens on that PAR, you'll receive a notification email letting you know a copy of that PAR document was added to e-case. That's an exact copy of the response from that payer. So that exact copy is placed in the e-case, and the attorney has access to that request.
There's a question about the time frame to submit an appeal, and that time frame for the provider is 10 calendar days from the carrier response. There is no option to appeal outside of that time frame.
There's a question, how do we adjudicate level 3 PARs? I assume that means how does the patient request adjudicative review of level 3 PAR decisions if a PAR is denied at level 3? The physician or the provider does not request the adjudication. It's either the patient's representative, or if the patient's not represented, the patient themselves I can present it to the workers' comp judge for that claim.
There's a question, when by mistake, maybe a delegate prepares a PAR and the wrong provider submits it, or the wrong information is requested, is there a way to cancel a PAR request or withdraw a request? And the current system does not allow a PAR to be canceled.
There's a question about how to actually sign up for OnBoard as a provider. The board's made it very easy. If you visit the board website, click on the medical portal overview button. Once on that screen, you'll see different stakeholder types. One of those is provider, and you'll see an option for new user access and administration. When you click that, right towards the top, we'll be requesting access, and there'll be a sign up button that provider will click. From there, it's just filling out a few basic pieces of information, including their MPI and license number if they're a New York State licensed provider. And once they hit submit, within 2 to 3 business days, they will be emailed a board assigned user ID and temporary password.
There's a question about services that were ultimately denied at level 2 by the provider. It looks like an EMG and some PT. If level 2 was denied by the carrier, the recourse for the provider would be to escalate to level 3.
The question, is there the 10-day time frame to appeal calendar or business days? And the answer is calendar. Yes, calendar days.
And it looks like there's another question about requirements for electronic medical billing. And again, we strongly encourage providers to submit bills electronically via a clearinghouse and XML trading partner, but there is no requirement that you bill electronically effective July 1st or any date.
Hi, there's a follow-up from the psychologist regarding a level 3 PAR that was denied. At that point, if the level 3 PAR is denied, the patient, injured worker can file a request for further action.
And that request for further action, if appropriately filed, will result in an adjudication review and a notice of decision being issued. The provider should receive a copy of that notice of decision when it is issued.
There's a question about who performs the level 3 review. Is it the board or the insurance carrier? All level 3 reviews are done by the board's medical director's office.
And one more question about additional documentation. To reiterate, if the payer reaches out to the provider using the request for information function during their review period and asks for additional documentation or asks questions, the provider can, at that point, attach additional documentation in response to that request from the payer. But it has to be initiated by a payer request for information.
There's a question as to whether the carrier's physician who reviews special services costing more than $1,000 has to be authorized by the New York State Workers' Comp Board. Pardon me. Let me get a drink here.
There's a question about HP1 responses. The OnBoard limited release functionality is solely for the submission of an HP1 to the board. The remainder of the process, including request for information for arbitration, an administrative award, an objection to an award, and a possible rescission of an award, the request for judgment, the awarding of judgment. All of that process remains the same and happens in paper outside of OnBoard limited release. There's a question about the RFA, request for further action form. There are there's actually three, but there's two versions of the request for further action form that would be applicable to the claimant. The RFA 1W would be if the claimant or patient is filling it out themselves. The RFA 1LC would be if the claimant's attorney is filling it out for them. Those forms are available on the board's website and can be submitted as we accept all of our paper forms. They could be mailed, they can be emailed, there could be a secure upload, however the party chooses to submit that form.
Question regarding what browsers are supported by the OnBoard system. OnBoard supports Edge Chromium, which is the blue and green E, Safari, Firefox, and Chrome. It does not support older browsers such as Internet Explorer 11 or the older version of Edge, which is the blue E. If you use those, you can receive various errors about the system not responding or other errors because that is an unsupported browser. There's another question about where to find the training for the OnBoard system. Again, if you visit the board website, towards the top, you'll see a Learn About OnBoard button. If you click that, it then breaks it down based on your provider type, whether it's provider, medical supplier, payer, or attorney. I again encourage anyone on here to visit that, and within each of those sections there's a training option. If you click that, it will literally break it down for you based on your dashboard, how to navigate it, how to submit PARs. It goes over things such as requests for more information, and again we'll give you screenshots and step-by-step instructions for each of those various functions in OnBoard.
There's a follow-up question with respect to the difference between special services and non-MTG PARs over 1,000. A prior authorization for special services is detailed in Section 324 of the regulations, and there are various procedures that are considered special services that previously were requested on a C4 authorization form. Those procedures, again, they're listed, and they're more complicated procedures such as lumbar fusions, whereas a non-MTG over 1,000 prior authorization would be a prior authorization that is not related to an MTG body part. So that's the difference.
And with that answer, we will conclude today's webinar. Thank you all for participating. For full details and instructions, please see the updated training web pages for healthcare providers and medical suppliers. If you need assistance with OnBoard registration or technical support, email WCB customer support at wcb.ny.gov. If you need assistance with OnBoard processes, email the board's medical director's office at wcb.medicaldirectorsoffice@wcb.ny.gov. For all other questions, please email onboard at wcb.ny.gov. At the closing of this webinar, you will be linked to a survey. Your input here is greatly appreciated and will help us plan and improve future sessions and update our OnBoard resources. Thank you all again and have a wonderful day.